Greetings everyone, I am Syed Ali Zia Jafri and I welcome you to the CSSPR webinar series in which we analyze a bevy of security, strategic and foreign policy issues. Earlier this month, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Israel should deal with Iran in line with its national interests. That Rubio said this in response to a question on whether the Trump administration would support Israel's kinetic actions against Iran does not augur well for Middle Eastern security. At a time when Iran is grappling with the weakening of its allies and, as per the International Atomic Energy Agency, pressing the pedal on uranium enrichment, such remarks will only bring the region closer to a major showdown. Its ramifications will permeate and be felt in the nuclear non-proliferation diplomacy space. Certainly, Washington's espousal of Tel Aviv, a nuclear possessor outside of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, will further attenuate the even otherwise dim prospect of establishing a nuclear weapon free zone in the Middle East. And because the creation of such a zone is an integral part of the NPT, not least since 1995, Washington's approach will contribute to eroding both the treaty and the global non-proliferation regime. But this is just one of the challenges the global nuclear order faces today. The erosion of arms control, the return of great power competition and interstate wars, um, and the proliferation of emerging and disruptive technologies are undermining the global nuclear order and increasing the salience of nuclear weapons. All this makes nuanced discussions on such issues all the more timely and necessary. Today, I'm fortunate to be joined by Tariq Rauf, a longtime policy practitioner of nuclear diplomacy. Some words about him. He is an internationally respected authority on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation issues from 2017 until 2019. He was a member of the Group of Eminent Persons for Substantive Advancement of Nuclear Disarmament established by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. He was also the director of the Disarmament Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Programme at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. His substantive engagements in nuclear diplomacy resulted in his appointment as the senior advisor for the chair of the Disarmament Committee at the 2015 Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. From 2002 until 2011, he was head of the Verification and Security Policy Coordination Office at the International Atomic Energy Agency, reporting to the Director General, in which capacity he dealt with high priority verification cases involving Iran, Iraq, Libya, North Korea, South Korea, and Syria, and was coordinator of multilateral approaches to the nuclear fuel cycle from 2003 until 2012. He was also the alternate head of the IAEA delegation to NPT conferences from 2003 until 2010 and the IAEA Liaison and Point-of-Contact for a number of multilateral control regimes and United Nations Security Council committees. From 87 until 2000, he was expert advisor to Canada's NPT delegations. His areas of interest include nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear disarmament, nuclear security, international and regional security, nuclear weapon free zones, international organizations, regional security, especially in North Africa, North America, South Asia, and the Middle East, among others. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It has always been a pleasure to listen to your opinions and thoughts about a number of uh, issues that the global nuclear order faces. Uh, when I was preparing for this podcast, I specifically wanted to uh, have Middle East as the hook because you've done a lot of work on the middle on the WMD free zone in the Middle East. Recently, in the recent past, you wrote a policy paper for the Toda Institute on how we could establish a Middle Eastern nuclear weapon free zone or a WM weapon free zone. So my first question pertains to that. For the benefit of our audience, I would just want you to shed light on how the establishment of the nuclear weapon free zone in the Middle East is further being compromised as a result of um, Washington's unquestionable and unqualified support to Tel Aviv, both in the non-proliferation space and in the foreign policy space. We saw statements at the 2024 PrepCom in which the US delegate categorically said, while we are committed to establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, we take exception to how Israel is being called out by states, and this is something that we don't agree with. So when you don't agree with something and you continue to espouse out and out a nuclear possessor in the very region, how can you talk about the establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East? Over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you, Ali, for having me on the podcast and for your generous introduction. And I'm happy to do this podcast with you for CSSPR, your center at the University of Lahore, which is an independent university and doing excellent work in training both undergraduates and graduates. So, the issue of the Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction actually goes back nearly 4 decades now. But without reciting old history, I would submit that when we extended the Non-Proliferation Treaty indefinitely in 1995, one of the key criteria for the extension was the support of the 3 depository states of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that is the United Kingdom, Russian Federation, and the United States. So these 3 countries co-sponsored the resolution at the 1995 NPT Review and Extension Conference, in which they committed to working with the states of the region to establish such a zone in the region of the Middle East. Without this resolution, the 22 Arab states would not have supported the indefinite extension of the NPT, and the NPT probably by now would not exist anymore were it not for this resolution. So my position is that the United States is legally bound under that particular resolution to work with the states of the region to get to a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. Now, if we fast forward to the 2010 NPT Review Conference, one of the actions was that there would be a conference to be held in 2012, co-sponsored by the 3 NPT depository states. But the United States was the first one to back away from that conference. And then a special facilitator was appointed. He was the State Secretary for Foreign Affairs of Finland, Jaakko Laeva, who held a series of meetings on the margins of Geneva in a place called Lyon. And at the 2015 review conference, he provided his assessment. But as you know, the 2015 NPT review conference failed because of the issue of the Middle East zone, when the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom vetoed the consensus outcome of that review conference, calling for or calling on the UN Secretary General to start convening annually conferences on establishing the zone and commencing the work of drafting treaty elements. The United States did not want to agree to it. So if we fast forward again to 2018, at the First Committee and at the General Assembly of the United Nations, the Arab states got a decision through a resolution that was voted upon and adopted by a vote, according to which, starting in 2019, the Secretary General of the UN would convene an annual conference. So the United States basically called this decision an illegitimate decision. I should correct myself. This resolution was adopted in 2017 at the 2018 NPT PrepCom. This was the US statement. And so conferences have been held, but the Arab states also are not making a lot of progress, unfortunately. So under the current situation in Gaza, starting from a year or so ago, this issue is now on the back foot. Unfortunately, even though we now have no more nuclear weapon acquisition or development programs in Iraq, Libya, Syria. Those are all over. There's a new government in Syria, so the outstanding issue there will quickly be resolved. So the other outstanding issues concern Iran's nuclear activities and, of course, Israel's accession to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And also, although Israel is a signatory to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, it has not yet ratified it. And Israel is one of the 44 Annex II states under the CTBT whose signature and ratification is required for entry into force. So my final comment with regard to this particular part of our discussion is that for the time being, in my view, the zone is on the back burner. At the IAEA as well, there is a resolution on application of safeguards in the Middle East, and during my time, I was responsible for this, and also for convening a forum at the IAEA on the experience of the existing nuclear weapon-free zones, and there are 5 of them, that could be relevant for the region of the Middle East. So such a forum was held in November 2011, but also since then, the member states at the IAEA have not agreed to hold such a forum, and I keep encouraging them to adopt another decision at the General Conference of the IAEA to convene such a forum so we can at least work on the technical part of the verification requirements of a nuclear weapon-free zone. You are muted at the moment.
Thank you very much for this incisive answer. I think you've raised a number of important points which take us to other elements of the puzzle in the Middle East. When the Middle Eastern WMD free zone is at the back burner, that according to US's own position has a direct impact on security guarantees, because that's also one of the most problematic areas within the NPT. If you read, obviously, statements by the US delegate at the NPT 2024 PrepCom, those establish a linkage between the establishment of weapon-free zones and the provision of so-called negative security assurances. So that is one thing that I would like you to comment on. So what's the impact of all this trouble on the even otherwise weakening situation with regard to security assurances? And 2, this outright support to Israel is also, in my opinion, making it harder and harder for a return to the JCPOA. Iran, as you just noted, there's a new government in Syria. Iran has lost other allies in the Middle East, and it is also enriching, as I said in my intro, uranium. So how do you think all this will have an impact on JCPOA and negotiations around that? Because I think that's really important, and if we don't come back to the JCPOA, any kind of a deal that could resonate with some of the themes of JCPOA, I think we are in big trouble.
Okay, so this particular problematic. So in connection with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, non-nuclear weapon states wanted positive security assurances. So this was under Resolution 255 of 1968, under which the nuclear weapon states, the ones who signed the NPT in 1968 with the 3 depositories, China and France, did not join until much later. But under the positive security assurances, the permanent members of the Security Council said in the resolution that they would come to the assistance of a non-nuclear weapon state that had suffered a nuclear attack. And then if we fast forward to 1995, again in the context of the indefinite extension, another resolution was adopted, and this was on negative security assurances, in which the nuclear weapon states undertook not to threaten or not to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. But each of the nuclear weapon states put certain conditions. So these were not unconditional security assurances. And in connection with nuclear weapon-free zones, each of the 5 nuclear weapon-free zones requires security assurances. Not all nuclear weapon states have given security assurances to all of the 5 nuclear weapon-free zones. And we should understand that both positive and negative security assurances, so to speak, are just words. There's no way or mechanism to enforce these. So I wouldn't put much faith in security assurances. This is the same problem with the Budapest Memorandum vis-a-vis Ukraine. And if we look at the Budapest Memorandum from 1994, this was a memorandum, not a treaty, not a convention, because the nuclear weapon states did not want to give, quote unquote, a guarantee to come to the assistance of Ukraine, basically to consult. So this is the problem with the security assurances. So with regard to the Middle East zone, since we do not yet have a treaty, this issue still is moot until we have a treaty text, which has annexes which contain security assurances for the nuclear weapon states. I think it's premature to discuss that. Now, coming to Iran and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was agreed on the 15th of July, 2015, this is dead. I mean, there's no point talking about another JCPOA. The JCPOA is no longer functionally in existence. So Iran was continuing to implement the restrictions on its nuclear program, that is not exceeding a stockpile of enriched uranium beyond 300 kilograms, not exceeding enrichment beyond 3.5% or so, not having more centrifuges other than 5,016 in an enrichment mode, and 1,044 in a research and development mode. So until the Trump administration's first term, the IAEA kept on issuing reports every 3 or 4 months saying Iran was living up to its obligations under the JCPOA and also Security Council Resolution 2231, which basically the Security Council also sanctioned, meaning approved the implementation of the JCPOA. So once the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, this was around May, I think. So Iran waited for a whole year, and starting in June 2019, it started taking steps to loosen itself from the limitations under the JCPOA. But each time they would announce a step, they would give the IAEA advance notification. So there were no surprises. So today, Iran has somewhere around 7,000 centrifuges in production mode. It has really 6,600 kilograms of enriched uranium across different enrichment levels, of which 182.3 kilograms are 60%, and you have 20%, 5%, and then about 2%. So the new government in Iran under President Pezeshkian has been trying to make all kinds of overtures to the Trump administration, but at the moment, Washington is busy with other issues. So there are 2 types of speculation. One is what you referred to, where Israel under Prime Minister Netanyahu for a long time has been trying to get US support to attack Iran's nuclear and missile facility. Under the Biden administration, they did not get that support. And also until November or December of last year, the Biden administration at the official level kept on saying that Iran was not working to develop a nuclear weapon, although it was not observing the JCPOA limits. So under the Trump administration, there are 2 schools of thought. One is that he would support or even join Israel in attacking Iran's the nuclear and missile facilities. But another school of thought suggests that he at some point would want to make a grand gesture to Iran to resolve this issue and open up Iran to American business. Recall that in his first administration, he met with Kim Jong-un of North Korea 3 times. He even stepped across the boundary at Panmunjom into North Korea. He was criticized a lot for that, and I'm one of those who supported him for that. Because we've been stuck into these silos of thinking. And so Trump has broken one silo with regard to the peace deal with Ukraine and the Ukraine war, Russian attack on Ukraine. But the other silo is the Iran nuclear file. So I'm hopeful that the Trump administration will choose the second option, which is to reach out to the Iranian government and to find some way out of this conundrum. Although I'm sure he's going to face a lot of opposition domestically and also from Israel, but there are times where Trump has stood up to Prime Minister Netanyahu. So this, I think, is something that remains to be seen. Although I must add here that the European Union here is now being a disruptive actor in my view. So in November of last year, IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi visited Iran, and Iran accepted his request to stop the accumulation of uranium enriched at 60%, meaning they could continue to enrich, but they would recycle the enriched material, so there would be no increase in the stockpile of 60% enriched uranium. And they also agreed to additional inspectors. But then the European Union adopted a resolution by a vote that divided the board. 19 countries voted for it out of 35. 2 were opposed and the rest abstained. So the IAEA board is badly divided. And as a result of that resolution, Iran then reversed itself, reversed the commitments given to IAEA Director General on the 60% enrichment, and they actually speeded it up. So that was a negative view. Now we have another board meeting coming up of the IAEA Board of Governors at the beginning of March. And it seems that the 3 European countries, France, Germany, and the UK, want to have yet another resolution, because we must remember that in October 2025, Resolution 2231 falls away. And so these countries are trying to lay the groundwork for so-called snapback of UN sanctions, which have been suspended. But in my view and the view of others who are tracking the Iran file, this would be a very negative development by the European Union and by these 3 countries. This has been one of their signal achievements, and they really are showing a complete lack of leadership on this issue.
Yes, I think one of the most destructive decisions that the Trump administration made in his first time around was reneging on the JCPOA. Iran was compliant, as you rightly pointed out. And the idea was that the JCPOA was not liked because of reasons which were not part of the JCPOA. So Iran was compliant, but Trump was adamant that no, Iran's activities in the Middle East and its ballistic missile program are an anathema to peace and stability in the region and beyond. But those elements were not part of the agreement. So the agreement was reneged on because of things which were not even part of the agreement. So I think Iran exercised a lot of patience, as you rightly said. At least for 1.5 years, Iran did not do anything, did not restart enrichment. And now, if this maximum pressure fantasy, I would call it, if this is again applied, things could go out of hand, because, so as you know, since 1979, Iran has relied on an indirect approach to dealing with its adversaries in the Middle East and beyond. But now, with its axis of resistance getting disintegrated, and scholars have written about it will have all the incentives to press ahead the nuclear option more than ever before. So things are not good, in my opinion, in the Middle East, and I agree. The second option should be exercised, and hopefully would be exercised. Um, Europe is not happy with how JD Vance spoke at the Munich Security Conference. In another podcast, we hosted did a program on that, and there's a lot of consternation in Europe with regard to um, an impending deal between Moscow and DC. Um, and Trump made a very short and surprising note uh, um, yesterday on Zelensky and how he has dragged the war. So things are not good at that end. So you talked about North Korea.
So can I just come back here?
Yes, absolutely.
So the Trump administration adopted this policy of maximum pressure, but that was because they agreed with Iran that, according to them, a weakness in the JCPOA was that Iran was allowed to continue with enrichment. Whereas the policy of the Bush administration, Bush Jr., was zero centrifuges spinning in Iran. And the Iran nuclear file started around August of 2002. But by the end of 2003, Iran had suspended enrichment as a result of an initiative proposed by the IAEA Director General at the time, Mohammad al-Baradei, and supported by the three European countries, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And so Iran was willing to freeze its enrichment program at that time, but they only wanted to keep 20 centrifuges in a research mode. But the Bush policy was zero centrifuges spinning. So we lost all this time until 2015. And then Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu were really enraged that the JCPOA allowed Iran to enrich. So and under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, a non-nuclear weapon state can enrich uranium in any amount at any level, provided it is not used to make a nuclear bomb, and the material and the process is under IAEA inspection, which is actually the case now. So in return, in response to the policy of maximum pressure, Iran adopted the policy of maximum resistance. So now some commentators have confused this, and you use the term axis of resistance, which I dispute that. So their policy of maximum resistance was to continue and expand their uranium enrichment program. So Iran now has 15 generations of centrifuges. In some respects, in my view, they are more advanced than Pakistan and North Korea in their centrifuge program, given the designs. But they're only using 4 of the 15 designs in a production mode. That is, centrifuges spinning to produce enriched uranium in an accumulation mode. Plus, the other part of the strategy of maximum resistance was to develop a delivery system, which is ballistic missiles. And they demonstrated that when General Soleimani was assassinated in Iraq, Iran attacked an American base in Iraq using ballistic missiles. And shortly before or after that, they also targeted a refinery of Aramco in Saudi Arabia, again showing pinpoint accuracy. And then after the assassination of the Hamas leader in Tehran, they did hit 2 Israeli air bases from where the planes were launched, although the Western media accepted the Israeli propaganda that those bases were not hit. They were hit and they suffered damage. They didn't suffer catastrophic damage, but it showed that the Iron Dome and the Patriot system was not fully effective. So even though in the retaliation, reportedly Israel has hit a lot of Iran's air defense radars and so on, were Iran to be attacked, its nuclear facilities attacked, they can easily block the Persian Gulf. They can target oil facilities in Saudi Arabia or American bases. So this is a very dangerous strategy. Iran has also, for the first time now, officially threatened that were it to be attacked, it would then withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is something they have not done before. So a country may still be weak or be weakened, but they are not totally defenseless. And so policymakers and the commentariat in Western countries sometimes gets overconfident in making these types of assessments, and I would caution against that.
You have reminded me of a famous quote by Henry Kissinger in his book, The World Order. He said, I have traveled around the world, and the country that is most committed to its national interest is Iran. And I think that really resonates well, especially for the post 1979 Iran, because the Shah's Iran was a different Iran, and this Iran is a totally different Iran. And yes,
The Shah's Iran, the oil embargo against the West was first initiated by the Shah of Iran in the 73 war. And then the other Arab countries joined in. Iran was the first to nationalize. That's why Mossadegh was overthrown.
yeah,
So
and
in pre-revolutionary times, they had quite a strong nationalist policy.
yeah,
After the revolution, when Saddam, Iraq attacked Iran and chemical weapons were used against Iran 3 times. And there are UN reports confirming this, but the international community did nothing. Then for the first time, when ballistic missiles were used to target cities, were also Iraqi ballistic missiles hitting Iran. Again, the international community did nothing. What they did was they came up with the Australia group on export control restrictions on chemical weapon precursors and the Missile Technology Control Regime, MTCR. I have other comments on these regimes, so I will not get into that at this point.
yes.
Uh,
I think
but
that
the problem is these days people don't read. People are not taught history. So people have a very narrow capsule view. And then in the media and then in articles and so on, all kinds of claims are made that are not backed up by reality.
I have always maintained whenever I discuss Iran with anybody, I said the days of Operation Ajax are gone. We can't, those days are long gone.
So
And
there are these 2 very good articles by Benoit Pelopidas, who's a nuclear historian at Sciences Po. One was published in the Non-Proliferation Review, where you are in Monterey, called The Oracles of Proliferation. And the second one is, if you Google Pelopidas and No Free Lunch, that's not the real title, but in the second article, he shows how the famous research institutes condition their findings based on who is giving them the money. So you should Google both of these articles and read them, and also put a link in the write-up for this podcast when you put it up. Benoit Pelopidas.
Yeah, Benoit has done some fabulous work for a number of years. And definitely, I will encourage our viewers to read those 2 articles that you mentioned. Thank you for that. So you talked about North Korea. So there was a time when Trump was saying Rocket Man and Fire and Fury, and then after a few months, Trump was meeting and greeting Kim Jong Un and calling him his best buddy. And I think yes, his idea of crossing the DMZ was to me an excellent one. It's better to do that than to listen to John Bolton. This is why perhaps he's too bitter right now, but that's for another day.
Yeah. North Korea, we are now coming up to 30 years since we had the agreed framework in 1994. Also, North Korea, to a certain extent, was living up to the agreed framework by freezing its nuclear program in 1994. But then the first breach came from the US side when Congress withdrew money for heavy oil to be sent to North Korea in return for them shutting down their nuclear reactors. Then we had this confrontation in September, October 2002, whether North Korea had an enrichment program, because under the agreed framework, they had agreed to give up the plutonium program. So this policy of complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament, CVID, proposed by the US, supported by South Korea and by Japan for 30 years, it is total failure. Because of this policy, we have had 6 nuclear weapon tests by North Korea. They were the 9th country to cross the threshold when they did their first test in 2006. They've done hundreds of ballistic missile tests. And even the head of the US intelligence some time back said there is no going back for North Korea on this. So we need to negotiate with them. They need to be assured that they will not be subject to a military attack from the United States. To remove the sanctions and to start some form of a freeze on their program and certain limitations. But dreaming about CVID and not changing that policy is just going down a tunnel. And I might also say for the record that nuclear weapons were introduced in the Korean Peninsula not by North Korea. Between 1958 to 1991, there were up to 2,000 nuclear weapons of the US of 11 different types. They were withdrawn under the Presidential Nuclear Initiatives of 1991. So at that time in 1958, there was no nuclear weapon program in North Korea. And also during the Korean War, General MacArthur threatened to use nuclear weapons against North Korea 3 times. Fortunately, he was denied the permission to do so. But the head of the US Air Force, Curtis LeMay, he used this famous term that there are no innocent civilians. We went to North Korea, we bombed them, and we killed 20% of their population. So, when we look at North Korea and their security perceptions or their threat perceptions or their fears, they're not irrational in that sense. So again, here when we read and talk about North Korean history, we don't look at it in a holistic way.
I think Kim is as rational as they come. He does not want to meet the same fate as Saddam and Gaddafi. And it's just recent history. It's not even old. It's very fresh in the memories of the collective memories of people. So, Elbridge Colby, he has not yet been confirmed, but he was one of the key people in the first administration, and he wrote an anti-China or a China-focused national defense strategy. So he made some remarks about South Korea. He said if South Korea wants to go nuclear, so be it. Our focus should be on countering China or mustering a lot of strength vis-a-vis China. So my question to you with regard to this is, so I'm glad that some scholars have started to talk about the utility of treating North Korea as an arms control problem. So I do understand the Trump administration is not perhaps fully committed now to CVID. It realizes that uh, a nuclearized North Korea is a reality that has to be dealt with. But from here, how do we move towards concrete arms control proposals vis-a-vis North Korea? Because those will be very important going forward. You can't, they won't roll back. That's a given.
Again, rewinding to the Trump visit when he met Kim Jong-un in Hanoi. Yep. At the Hanoi meeting, Kim Jong-un reportedly offered to dismantle the Yongbyon nuclear site, which is roughly 80% of North Korea's nuclear weapon program. But his Secretary of State Pompeo and his National Security Advisor Bolton, they advised Trump to reject that deal. And they said to North Korea, you first dismantle, and after we have verified, we will then remove sanctions. But by then, Kim Jong-un had already seen that the Trump administration had walked out of the JCPOA. And as you mentioned, they have seen the fates of Saddam and Gaddafi. So Kim Jong-un felt really insulted that he had made this bold offer to the US, and he was summarily rejected. So then when he went back, he basically announced that there would be no further arms control dialogue with the United States. And just recently, he reaffirmed that just a couple of weeks ago. And late last year, he said that we have now developed a standardized design for a nuclear warhead, and we will do serial production. So we don't need to do any further work in expanding our nuclear program. All we need to do is build more weapons, and they've already built and tested delivery systems that can reach the United States. So they want to set in place a deterrent.
It was quite instructive when you talked about the Hanoi meeting. It was quite instructive that a month before the Hanoi meeting, he said North Korea's nuclear weapon program is complete. So I think that was a strategic signaling on his part that these weapons are here to stay. Come what may, and let's negotiate further.
Now we have a problem. This is now referred to as friendly proliferation. So last year in January, the South Korean president said maybe either the US brings weapons back to South Korea or South Korea will develop its own. But then the Biden administration slapped him on his wrist, and 2 weeks later he said, no, we don't want to do it. We remain within the NPT. But then the people you have named, and in the incoming or the Trump administration, there are some, and even Trump at one point said, he wouldn't mind if Japan or South Korea or other allies develop their own nuclear weapons because the US didn't want to spend money to defend them. And this is his point now vis-a-vis the NATO countries and Ukraine. So why should I subsidize you? So this new phenomenon of friendly proliferation, where countries friendly to the US would be tolerated having nuclear weapons, is going to destroy the non-proliferation regime and the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it's very surprising that there has not been much pushback against this. If you compare the pushback that Trump is getting vis-a-vis his recent comments about President Zelensky and Ukraine, and the pushback vis-a-vis his comments about friendly countries developing their own nuclear weapons, there was no comparison. There was very little criticism voiced at that time. So this again shows the double standards and the weaknesses of the current regime, where it's very discriminatory. And as more and more NPT conferences end in discord, this regime is now beginning to corrode in its foundations. And so we have an NPT PrepCom coming up in end of April, beginning of May. And then we have a review conference next year. All signs are that both of these meetings will end in discord. So that means that 4 review conferences would have failed: 2005, 2015, 2022, and then 2026. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is not in force. It is also coming up to 30 years.
30 years, yeah, 96.
Next year. And instead of 8 countries, now there are 9 whose ratification and signature is required. So we have a backward slide in the arms control regime. And the arms control community has not risen to the challenge. They are still looking backward and moaning and groaning instead of coming up with new ideas on how to shore up the regime. The New START treaty will expire on the 5th of February next year. So we really need Russia and the United States, even if the treaty expires, or it will expire, to commit to maintaining the numerical limits of New START until they can reach some new agreement. Because if they don't, both countries can upload. The US can upload more than twice as many nuclear weapons on the empty places on top of ballistic missiles, and the Russians can do about 1.6. So they have roughly 1,550 deployed weapons. They can easily go to about 3,500 each without making too many new delivery systems. So again, this is a looming problem, and we don't hear much in the arms control community about this. We're still tied up in old thinking. And so what Trump has done with vis-a-vis the Ukraine war is he's burst that bubble of NATO dependency on the US, this old thinking of arming Ukraine so that it can negotiate from a position of strength. You wonder what these leaders in Europe have been smoking or drinking in their coffee, because every passing month, unfortunately, Ukraine's position has been weakening. So arming Ukraine to negotiate from a position of strength is a complete fantasy. And now that Trump has burst that bubble, in Europe, they don't know what to do. They're running around like crazy people. And so this, in the short term, by insulting Trump, they're only making their life worse. And Trump has said he does not like nuclear weapons. So we should encourage him to work with Russia and China to reduce nuclear weapons. And he's already made a proposal that he would like the three countries to reduce military expenditures and also to reduce nuclear weapons. And nobody's focusing on this. They're all beating their chests over the Ukraine issue.
It's ironic, like everybody really goes gaga over Reagan and Gorbachev, but nobody's talking about a more assertive statement being given by Trump. Not only, I think twice in the last 2 weeks he has said this, that I would like to talk denuclearization issues with China and Russia. So I have 2.5 questions from you. I say half because I want to bring this up because I think you are one of the very few people who have written about the creating the enabling environment for nuclear disarmament. I think I remember your article in Arms Control today in 2020, and you said the SEND proposal is an attempt by the US-led bloc to, you know, deviate or take the conversation to a place which where it does not belong. So, what's your take on the SEND proposal? And then I'll ask my last two questions.
I've been in the creating an environment for nuclear disarmament. This proposal was also, I think, put out in 2018 at the PrepCom in Geneva as creating the conditions for nuclear disarmament. And so that was heavily criticized. So the US then made it creating the environment. And some 25 countries were invited to this discourse, including India and Pakistan, who flew with supersonic speed to join this because they thought this was giving them recognition. And countries like Austria, who were championing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, also went, even though I was quite critical of that. I used the term that this is chasing unicorns and fairies and pixie dust and so on, because I have the same criticism of risk reduction, because both of these are deviating from the real issue, which is nuclear weapons. If you want to reduce the risks, reduce the number of nuclear weapons and eventually go to zero. If you want to create the environment for nuclear disarmament, then you need to compartmentalize arms control. This is what happened during the Cold War. Although there were issues with the Soviet Union on human rights, on economics and so on, arms control was compartmentalized. This is how we got the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972, the original Strategic Arms Limitation treaties. And then in parallel, we had the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe that led to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where we dealt with the other baskets of human rights and trade issues. So, and even in the worst times of the Cold War, when there were Soviet tanks in Prague crushing dissent, in Hungary, there were still talks with the Soviet Union. So this position after February 22, that no talking to Russia is a completely self-defeating proposition. But then Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, made this proposal that the US was willing to talk to Russia without preconditions. And it could be at a higher level or at a lower level, and to compartmentalize. But by then, the US had adopted this position of achieving the strategic defeat of Russia in Ukraine. And so the Russians said, well, as long as that is your policy, we don't want to come and talk to you. So that led to the suspension of implementation of New START and so on. So I'm glad now that with amazing speed, the Trump administration has already had its first meeting. with the Russians in Riyadh, with the Saudi sponsorship, and that's the way to go, is to talk to the adversary. You don't need to talk to your friends about issues because you don't have problems with your friends. But when you have a problem with your neighbor over the fence, you need to talk to them to resolve this issue. So for the Western countries, the Biden administration, and for the Europeans to regard talking arms control and security issues with Russia is a reward to Russia is completely crazy. It just shows the regression in thinking on these issues and the cloud that has come over this over the past 3 or 4 years. So whatever the faults might be of President Trump on other issues, on this issue, I support his way of thinking. First of all, engaging with North Korea in his first term, breaking the bubble and beginning to talk with Russia. Hopefully these negotiations will lead to some positive outcome, regardless of the fact that the Europeans now don't know what to do and they're running around like chickens with their head cut off.
You have already answered my next question. I have always maintained and I, the very idea of deterrence is incomplete without risks. If there are no risks, there is no deterrence. So when you say we want to reduce risks, and then you say we want to enhance our deterrence, that those two do not gel well together. They're completely opposite. If you increase deterrence or enhance deterrence, you are generating more risks, because if there are no risks, there is no deterrence. So that's sort. Now, this and I'm at times I'm a bit appalled at how even US history is not referred back to. Bob McNamara was very categorical in the during the Cuban Missile Crisis in saying that the enemy gets a vote. Strategic empathy. This idea of strategically defeating a nuclear possessor is just not. It's just bizarre. You can't strategically defeat a country having thousands of nuclear weapons. So that's obviously a problem that we need to deal with. My absolute last question. So I had Tong Zhao with the Tong Zhao on this program, and he wrote an excellent report on how China looks at nuclear weapons as part of its political um, inventory. The US wants China to talk about arms control. China says you cannot talk about arms control if you have problems at the political level. Uh, it is important for China and the US to talk arms control and have a substantive conversation on that. But if the US does not feel the need to engage politically with China and only wants to talk about arms control while ignoring the overall dynamics of its relations with China, I think that won't be a possibility. What's your take on the way forward with regard to arms control between the US and China?
So a lot of the recent literature coming out of the US talks about this spectacular buildup by China. And so, and that, China is going to, by 2030 or 2035, will have as many nuclear weapons as the US and Russia, which is factually incorrect. They apparently are building up to 1,500, which is what the deployed number. Russia and the US each have more than 5,000 nuclear weapons.
Yeah. So nowhere near.
If you look at the buildup of the Soviet Union and the United States in the 60s and 70s, it was much faster than what China is doing now. Yeah. So this, again, in my view, shows the dishonesty of our own community in hyping this the so-called risks. So for China, I also talk to them quite often here and elsewhere. Their concern is that, I'm not necessarily saying I agree with this point of view, but I'm just telling you what I've heard from their side. So the Chinese view is that we had very few deliverable systems. And with the US building up ballistic missile defenses, it puts at risk our capability and it makes us vulnerable to a first strike. So we need to build more systems to overcome to have sufficient residual weapons left, were we subjected to a first strike. So we are not aiming for superiority or equalization with the US. We just want to have a secure second strike capability, and that's what we are wanting to do. The US doesn't believe in this. China also says that one cannot have a schizophrenic policy of competing with China in one area, confronting China in yet another area, and obstructing China in a third area. It's not how human beings work. And so this is, and the European Union has also joined the US on the trade issue in the same way. We will compete in certain areas, we will collaborate in other areas, and we will sort of obstruct China in the third area. So this part of the equation, so to speak, needs to be sorted out. And from my understanding, and Tong Jia has said this as well, I was also with him in a recent meeting, that closed meeting that was held in Istanbul, that China feels that the US wants to talk arms control with them to constrict their development. So they want to be in a better negotiating position. Secondly, they say that, the defense minister of China is under personal sanctions of the US. So you want to talk to us, why are you putting sanctions on our senior officials? And overall, the policy of hostility, they feel a policy of hostility. So there needs to be some change here if one wants to engage with China. China does come to the Non-Proliferation Treaty conferences and PrepCons, and there they do engage. Where they're not engaging is bilaterally with the US. I would recommend that they did have a meeting in November of 2023. But each side came away dissatisfied because they went in with different expectations. So I hear that a meeting is being thought of between President Xi and President Trump, just like another meeting is being thought of between Presidents Trump and Putin. Hopefully these summit meetings happen so we can have some breakthroughs at the political level. Because if we leave it to the academic community and the policy community, they are going to stick to their own particular silos without any breakthroughs coming. And I'm sort of sorry to have this critical view of our own community. Although there are some, like the Arms Control Association and a few other voices in the wilderness that basically, and the Quincy Institute, that do talk rationally on these issues, in my point.
I completely share your pessimism on these issues. Look, political relationships have to be sorted first. You can't have it both ways. You can't talk about countering China in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere, and then tell them to engage in substantive arms control agreements. Which has a lot of transparency about them. So it takes two to tango. It does not take one.
That so you have the Quad for containment of China, which brings in India, although India is being a half-hearted partner in Quad.
Yes.
Then providing nuclear-powered submarines to Australia, which the Chinese are opposing here in the IAEA. Rightly so, because this is going to blow a big hole in the IAEA safeguard system under the NPT for non-nuclear weapon states. So this was again a Biden genius idea. Hopefully, AUKUS, the submarine cooperation with Australia, hopefully should die out, but we don't know.
Surprisingly, Trump hasn't said enough about Trump or his team haven't said enough about AUKUS.
He has said one statement about AUKUS, but I think his reference was more to Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which is cooperation in AI and the defense industrial base.
Yes.
Whereas Pillar 1 is submarines, and that is limited to the US, UK, and Australia. Because Japan and South Korea last year tried to make some noises whether they could also get nuclear-powered submarines, and the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin at the IISS meeting in Singapore, Shangri-La Dialogue very firmly shut them down. Nuclear submarines cooperation is only with Australia.
So thank you so very much, Dr. Tariq, for this excellent, hard-hitting analysis and survey of the global nuclear order and the non-proliferation order, which is very much a part of it. It has always been a pleasure to engage with you and to listen to your thought-provoking arguments. I look forward to having you talk about these issues. Unfortunately, things are not going to get any better, and we will need people like you to come delve on these issues. If the world was getting better, we would have talked about literature and other light stuff, which obviously also is relevant to our space and field. But thank you very much once again. This is it from this episode. I look forward to engaging another uh, expert on another important topic that the world is grappling with. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, goodbye.